Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the dusty corners of history, specifically into the bizarre, sometimes hilarious, and often surprisingly rigid ideas people had about body hair and hip shape throughout the ages, often enshrined in texts that were, believe it or not, precursors to modern sex manuals, or at least guides to attracting a partner. Imagine trying to navigate social interactions centuries ago, sweating under layers of linen or wool, not just worrying about plagues or pirates, but also whether that stray hair on your upper lip or the curve of your calf met some unspoken, ancient standard. It's a journey through changing tastes and persistent anxieties, and frankly, you probably won't survive this without questioning at least one personal grooming choice you've ever made. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in a Victorian drawing room with hushed whispers about ankles, but much, much further back in the cradles of civilization. Think ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. These places weren't exactly debating the merits of Brazilian waxes and papyrus scrolls, but they absolutely had strong opinions, codified or not, about what a good body looked like. And that included the presence or absence of hair and the pleasingness of certain curves. You might imagine our earliest ancestors wandering around in animal skins, blissfully unaware of such trivialities, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Even then, appearance mattered. Let's start with ancient Egypt. When you picture Egyptians, you likely envision smooth-skinned figures with elaborate kohl-lined eyes, and you'd be pretty spot on. For the elite, at least, a clean, hairless body wasn't just about aesthetics. It was tied to hygiene, purity, and social status. Think of the scorching Egyptian heat. Less hair equals less sweat and potentially less odor, a practical concern elevated to a spiritual one. Priests, in particular, were expected to be completely hairless, including their eyebrows and eyelashes, shaving multiple times a day to maintain ritual purity. Imagine doing that before the invention of decent shaving cream. You'd be a permanently irritated, perpetually stubbly mess. So, hair removal was a big deal. They weren't just grabbing some sharp flint and hoping for the best. Egyptians developed sophisticated methods. Pumice stones were used for abrasion, bronze razors, sharp enough to be impressive for the time, but probably still terrifyingly dull by modern standards, were common, and they even had precursors to waxing. Recipes found on papyri describe concoctions made from substances like honey, sugar, and oil, heated and applied to the skin, remarkably similar to modern sugaring techniques. You can almost feel the sticky heat and the sharp rap as they pulled it off, wincing perhaps, but dedicated to the cause. This wasn't just a women's thing either. Men, especially those in higher classes, also practiced extensive hair removal. A man with a smooth chest was not just acceptable, he was often considered more attractive and civilized. This flips our modern script a bit, doesn't it? We often associate male body hair with ruggedness or masculinity, but in ancient Egypt, it was sleek and smooth that conveyed refinement. Beyond hair, body shape played a role, though maybe less explicitly documented in the way later sex manuals would dissect every inch. Egyptian art, while often stylized, does show a preference for slender, somewhat elongated figures, regardless of gender. The famous bust of Nefertiti, for instance, depicts a woman with a long, graceful neck and a relatively narrow frame. However, fertility was paramount, and depictions of deities or women associated with childbirth, like Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, or figurines from earlier periods, often emphasize rounded bellies, breasts, and hips. These weren't necessarily seen as sexy in a purely aesthetic sense, but rather as signs of vitality, health, and the ability to bear children. Qualities deeply valued in a society reliant on continuation and renewal. So, while elite beauty might lean towards slender, there was also a profound respect, almost reverence for the fertile form, particularly in religious or symbolic contexts. It wasn't one size fits all, even back then. Let's hop over to Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here, beauty standards are a little harder to pin down definitively from the surviving artifacts, but we can glean some insights. Cylinder seals and statues show figures that are often stockier than the Egyptians, with more emphasis on muscularity for men and a certain sturdiness for women. Body hair on men, particularly beards, was highly valued, a symbol of wisdom, power, and maturity. Elaborate curled beards were meticulously groomed and displayed, a far cry from the Egyptian preference for a smooth chin. This is a mainstream historical fact. Across many ancient cultures, the beard was a significant marker of male identity and status. Think of the powerful kings of Assyria with their magnificent, intricately styled beards. Shaving the beard off could be a sign of mourning, humiliation, or even punishment. So if you were a Mesopotamian man, you weren't worried about chest hair, but you definitely wanted a luxuriant, well-maintained beard. You probably had a guy whose job it was just to curl and oil your beard. Talk about dedication. For women in Mesopotamia, depictions are less clear on body hair, but we see emphasis on jewelry and elaborate hairstyles. Body shape again seems to lean towards a certain robustness, suggesting health and fertility were prized. Figurines sometimes show exaggerated hips and breasts, similar to those seen in other ancient fertility symbols found across the Near East and beyond. These artifacts aren't exactly sex manuals, but they function as visual guides to what was considered important or desirable in the human form within that cultural context. They tell us that body shape wasn't just a biological given, but something interpreted through a cultural lens, often linked to fundamental concerns like survival and reproduction. Moving into the Greek world, things get interesting, especially regarding the male form. The ancient Greeks, particularly the Athenians, developed a profound appreciation for the idealized athletic male body. Statues from this period often depict young men, kouroi, and later more dynamic figures with perfectly sculpted muscles, smooth skin, and a general absence of prominent body hair below the neck. This ideal was tied to the gymnasium, to athletic competition, and to the philosophical concept of kalokagathia, the idea that physical beauty, kalos, was intrinsically linked to moral goodness and nobility, agathos. A beautiful body reflected a beautiful soul, and a smooth-toned physique was the pinnacle of this. So, were Greek men expected to shave or epilate? Evidence suggests yes, particularly for athletes and those who frequented the gymnasia and palaestrae, which were social as well as physical spaces. Smooth skin was associated with youth, cleanliness, and the aesthetic ideal. Imagine the sheer volume of olive oil and strigils, those curved scrapers, needed to keep everyone looking so pristine after a workout. It makes modern gym routines seem positively low maintenance. This preference for the smooth male body is a quirky tidbit when contrasted with, say, the hairy masculinity of the Mesopotamians or even later Roman ideals. For women in ancient Greece, the ideal form is often depicted in statues like the Venus de Milo or Aphrodite of Knidos, softer, curvier figures than the male ideal, with rounded hips and breasts. While hair removal was also practiced by women, perhaps less religiously than by priests in Egypt or athletes in Greece, there wasn't the same overt emphasis on total hairlessness below the neck that we see in depictions of men. Female beauty ideals were more focused on curves, symmetry, and features like a straight nose, full lips, and often pale skin, a sign that you didn't have to work in the fields under the sun. Historians still argue whether the smooth male bodies in Greek sculpture reflected the reality of everyday male grooming, or if it was primarily an artistic convention, an idealized representation of youthful perfection and athletic prowess. Was the average Athenian dude walking around with a smooth chest and legs, or was that look reserved for the gym and statues? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Perhaps intense grooming was practiced by the elite, by athletes, and by those keen to embody the physical ideal, while others were perhaps less bothered. It's hard to know how widespread these practices truly were outside of the visual record. What these ancient cultures show us is that anxieties and ideals about body hair and shape are not a modern invention. They've been with us for millennia, tied to everything from religion and hygiene to social status, fertility, and philosophical concepts of beauty and goodness. The specific forms these anxieties took varied wildly. Beards were sometimes essential symbols of power, sometimes seen as uncivilized. Smoothness could signify purity, refinement, or athletic perfection. Curves were sometimes revered for fertility, sometimes less emphasized in favor of slenderness. These differing perspectives laid some of the foundational and often contradictory ideas about the correct human form that would echo through subsequent centuries. We might chuckle at their methods or specific preferences, but the underlying drive to conform, to be desirable, to project a certain image through one's physical appearance feels surprisingly familiar. So leaving the perfectly smooth, or ideally smooth anyway, physiques of the Greek gymnasium, you make your way into the world of the Roman Empire. And here things, well, they shift a bit. While the Romans certainly admired aspects of Greek culture, including their art and philosophy, their own ideals about the body, particularly the male body, diverged. If the Greeks prized youthful, athletic smoothness, the Romans, especially as the Republic matured and transitioned into the empire, tended to value maturity, gravity, the gravitas, and a certain ruggedness. You see this shift clearly in portraiture. Roman busts and statues, unlike the idealized Greek forms, often depicted men with realistic features, including wrinkles, receding hairlines, and yes, often body hair. While a clean-shaven face became increasingly fashionable over time, though emperors like Hadrian brought beards back for a while, the expectation of a completely smooth body below the neck lessened significantly compared to the Greek ideal. This is a mainstream historical fact. Roman men, particularly those of higher status, were often depicted with noticeable body hair on the chest and legs, a stark contrast to the Greek chorus. It wasn't just accepted, it was often associated with a certain virility and manliness that the Romans admired. Think of powerful senators or military leaders. Their statues project strength and authority, not necessarily youthful, hairless perfection. Of course, this doesn't mean Roman men were completely laissez-faire about their body hair. Far from it. While chest and leg hair might have been acceptable, hair in other areas was still considered unsightly or undesirable. Underarm hair was often removed, perhaps for hygiene reasons or simply aesthetic preference. And just like the Greeks, Romans frequented public baths, which weren't just places for washing, but also social hubs, gymnasia, and even libraries. In these spaces, grooming was part of the routine. You'd see men and women in separate areas or at different times, scraping their skin clean with strigils after oiling themselves, not just of dirt, but also perhaps finer hairs. Plucking was also common for eyebrows and other unwanted hairs. Imagine the scene, the steamy air, the echoing voices, the scraping sounds, the scent of oils and sweat, and people meticulously tweezing away. It sounds tedious, doesn't it? Like a particularly sweaty and public trip to the salon. Now, what about hairy backs? While visible chest hair on men was often accepted, a truly hairy back isn't typically lauded in Roman texts or depicted in ideal forms. It might have been seen as something a bit more animalistic or less refined, even within a culture that embraced body hair more than the Greeks. However, the Roman ideal wasn't defined by a lack of back hair, but rather by the presence of hair elsewhere, signaling maturity and strength. It's less about achieving total smoothness everywhere, and more about where hair was considered appropriate or even desirable. For Roman women, the ideals had some continuity with the Greek, but also distinct Roman elements. While Greek sculptures often depicted women with softer, perhaps less exaggerated curves than some earlier fertility figures, Roman taste, particularly under the Empire, continued to appreciate a certain voluptuousness. Health and the ability to bear children remained important, and this was often visually represented by rounded hips, a soft belly, and full breasts. Think of Venus figures from the Roman period. They often embody a similar curvy ideal to their Greek predecessors, perhaps even more pronounced in some domestic art or small figurines. Depicting women with prominent curves was not just an artistic convention. It reflected societal values. A matronly figure, perhaps a bit softer and rounder, could symbolize prosperity, domestic stability, and fertility, qualities highly valued in Roman society. While elite women likely strove for certain standards of beauty, including intricate hairstyles and fine clothing, their physical form was still viewed through a lens that appreciated health and the potential for motherhood. It wasn't the wafer-thin ideal you sometimes see today. You could have a bit of a belly and still be considered beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful because it signaled vitality. This emphasis on fertile curves is a quirky tidbit when contrasted with the sometimes ethereal, almost angular forms preferred in other historical periods or cultures. Hair removal for women was also practiced extensively in Rome. Just as in Egypt and Greece, smooth skin was often associated with cleanliness and desirability. Women used similar methods to men: pumice stones, primitive razors, and depilatory creams and pastes. These pastes could be made from a variety of ingredients, some quite harsh, including substances like resin, pitch, and even arsenic. Yikes. Imagine slathering arsenic paste on your skin in the name of beauty. You probably wouldn't survive that spa treatment. It certainly makes a modern waxing strip feel like a gentle caress. Plucking with bronze tweezers was also common, particularly for shaping eyebrows and removing facial hair. Beyond mere aesthetics, the Romans, influenced by Greek thought, began to incorporate medical and philosophical ideas into their understanding of the body and its ideal form. Physicians like Galen, whose work built upon Hippocrates, discussed the body's humors and temperaments. While their primary focus wasn't exactly sex appeal, their ideas about health, balance, and physical constitution could indirectly inform what was considered a good or desirable body. For instance, certain body types or even hairiness could be linked to specific temperaments or predispositions according to humoral theory. A very hairy man might be seen as having a different constitution than a smooth-skinned one, and these constitutions were associated with different characters or health tendencies. Philosophers, particularly Stoics and Epicureans, also had views on the body, though often in the context of self-control, moderation, and virtue. While they weren't writing beauty guides, their emphasis on maintaining health and avoiding excess could touch upon physical appearance. For example, Stoics might view excessive grooming as a form of vanity to be avoided, while advocating for basic hygiene and health. These philosophical perspectives didn't offer explicit instructions on hip-to-waist ratios or acceptable levels of back hair, but they contributed to a broader cultural understanding of what constituted a well-ordered and virtuous physical self. So while you won't find a Roman text titled Sexy Bod 101, you can find mentions of grooming practices, descriptions of desirable physical traits in poetry or letters, and medical treatises that discuss the body in ways that implicitly define norms. Texts on health, hygiene, and even household management sometimes included advice relevant to appearance. For instance, Celsus, a Roman medical writer, discussed treatments for removing unwanted hair, framing it as a medical issue or a matter of cleanliness. Historians still argue whether the descriptions of desirable body types in Roman literature and art truly reflect the lived reality and preferences of the majority of the population, or if they represent an elite ideal. Was the average Roman citizen as concerned with specific hip curves or levels of body hair as the emperors or poets? Or were these standards primarily aspirational, circulated among the wealthy and educated? It's hard to gauge how deeply these specific ideals permeated down through the social classes. We have depictions of empresses with specific features, but what about the farmer's wife or the urban laborer? Their concerns were likely more practical, focused on health and strength, rather than strict adherence to aesthetic ideals. The transition from Greek to Roman ideals shows that beauty standards are fluid and tied to changing cultural values. From Greek kolokagathia, emphasizing youthful perfection, to Roman gravitas, valuing mature strength and fertility. What was considered desirable body hair shifted, and while curvy figures remained appreciated for women, the reasons and the specific emphasis could vary. These ancient foundations, though seemingly simple, laid complex groundwork for later periods, where these ideas would be inherited, reinterpreted, and argued over for centuries to come. The pain of removing hair, the debate over what constitutes a good shape, these weren't just modern woes, they were part of the human experience, even thousands of years ago. discussed in bathhouses, debated by philosophers, and depicted, sometimes confusingly, in art. So you've journeyed from the gymnasiums of ancient Greece and the public baths of Rome, where bodies, both idealized and realistic, were often on display. Now you find yourself moving into a different era altogether, the European Middle Ages. And if the Roman era was a bit less fixated on total smoothness than the Greek, the Middle Ages represent a significant cultural shift, especially in how the physical body was perceived and presented. Imagine the world darkening just a little, not literally but metaphorically, as the overt display and celebration of the nude or semi-nude body, so prominent in classical art and public life, recedes significantly. The dominant cultural force now is Christianity, and with it comes a profound change in focus. The physical body, while still seen as God's creation, is often viewed with suspicion. It's the vessel for the soul, yes, but it's also a source of temptation, earthly desires, and sin. The focus shifts upwards towards salvation, spiritual purity, and the afterlife. This new emphasis had a huge impact on how people thought about beauty and the ideal form. Instead of sculpting perfect marble physiques, artists turned their attention to depicting saints, biblical scenes, and religious symbols. When human figures were shown, especially in religious contexts, they were often clothed, sometimes quite heavily. The ideal shifts from the physical to the spiritual, from outward perfection to inner virtue. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Christian emphasis on piety and the soul significantly de-emphasized the body as a primary site of aesthetic value compared to the classical world. Public nudity or revealing clothing became taboo, seen as immodest and potentially sinful, with bodies largely covered by layers of fabric, tunics, robes, cloaks. How did ideals about body shape and hairiness even matter? Well, they did, but in different, often more subtle ways. Beauty standards didn't vanish. They simply adapted to the new cultural landscape. Attention turned to what was visible. The face, hands, neck, and the way clothing draped, graceful posture, a serene expression, clear skin, and neatly styled hair on the head became more prominent markers of beauty, particularly for women. But what about the parts hidden beneath the fabric? While explicit discussions of body hair or specific hip measurements might have been less common in surviving texts than in, say, a Roman medical treatise discussing depilatories, implicit norms still existed. For men, facial hair varied in fashion. Beards went in and out of style depending on the century and region, sometimes associated with wisdom or holiness. Think of images of Christ or saints. Sometimes with rusticity. Body hair below the neck was rarely, if ever, discussed in terms of aesthetic appeal. If anything, excessive hairiness might be linked, in folklore or some moralizing text, to beastliness or unrefined natures, the opposite of the desired spiritual or aristocratic refinement. Conversely, extreme smoothness wasn't necessarily an ideal either, outside perhaps certain religious ascetic practices where any attention to the body was minimized. For women, the ideal body shape, even when hidden, continued to carry significance, primarily related to health and fertility. In an era before modern medicine, a woman's ability to bear healthy children was crucial for lineage and society. A certain roundness, a softness, was often associated with good health and the capacity for motherhood. While clothing masked the specifics, the general impression could convey these qualities. You might see this subtly reflected in depictions of Eve or other female figures in art where, despite stylistic variations, a softly rounded belly or hips might be present, not as an object of overt sexual display, but as a symbol of natural form and fertility. It wasn't about flaunting curves, it was about possessing the form associated with vitality, like a well-nourished plant ready to bear fruit. This continued appreciation for a fertile figure, albeit within a vastly different cultural context, is a quirky tidbit when you consider the stark contrast with later eras that prized extreme slenderness. Grooming practices certainly didn't disappear entirely, but their purpose shifted. Hygiene was important, though understanding of germ theory was non-existent. Cleanliness was often linked to godliness. While public baths declined in some areas after the Roman era, due to infrastructure decay and moral suspicion, too much potential for immodesty. Private bathing and efforts to remove dirt and pests continued. Hair removal, if practiced, was likely more for practical reasons, like preventing lice, or perhaps targeting specific visible areas like the face, eyebrows, upper lip, rather than extensive full-body routines. Depilatories might have been mentioned in medical texts, but perhaps more in the context of treating skin conditions than achieving aesthetic smoothness. Imagine trying to concoct a medieval depilatory using herbs, animal fats, and perhaps something nasty from the apothecary. You probably wouldn't survive that attempt at a smooth finish. It makes you appreciate modern hair removal cream, doesn't it? Information about these subtle norms comes less from explicit beauty manuals, which were rare, and more from indirect sources. Medical treatises influenced by lingering classical ideas about humors and constitution might describe different body types and link them to health or temperament. A person's physique could be seen as a reflection of their inner balance or humors. Poetry and literature might praise a lady's fair skin, rosy cheeks, or graceful neck, hinting at ideals without detailing hidden forms. Moralizing texts might warn against vanity or excessive attention to the body, revealing what practices were considered problematic. Even within the church, which preached spiritual focus, physical appearance wasn't entirely ignored. Monks, for example, often shaved their heads, the tonsure, and faces as a sign of humility and renunciation of worldly vanity. Cleanliness, though perhaps not driven by modern aesthetic standards, was still valued. Late in the Middle Ages, as wealth grew and societal structures became more complex, there's a gradual shift. Clothing became more elaborate, and the way fabric was cut could sometimes hint at or even subtly accentuate certain body shapes, like the high-waisted gowns of the late Gothic period that could make a woman appear pregnant, which was fashionable, perhaps again linked to fertility. Historians still argue whether the ideals hinted at in medieval art and literature truly reflected the desires of the populace or were primarily aristocratic or religious aspirations. Did a peasant woman in the field worry about her hip-to-waist ratio or the hairiness of her legs? Or was she focused on health, strength, and survival? Our evidence is heavily skewed towards the concerns and depictions of the elite and religious classes. It's hard to know what the average person considered beautiful in a physical sense, beyond basic markers of health and vitality needed for work and childbearing. The transition from the classical world to the medieval one wasn't a clean break. Some classical medical ideas, including those related to the body and health, were preserved and transmitted, often through Arabic scholarship, which flourished while Europe was undergoing significant changes. So while Ovid's beauty advice or Galen's anatomical notes weren't being read in every monastery or castle, filtered versions of this knowledge persisted and influenced medieval thinking about the body. The medieval period, therefore, offers a glimpse into beauty standards that were less about revealing perfection and more about what was implied or symbolized. A body wasn't just an object to be shaped and displayed. It was a vessel for the soul, subject to moral interpretation and often hidden from view. The focus on curves shifted from aesthetic pleasure to symbolic significance. Fertility, health, and body hair was rarely a topic of aspirational grooming, perhaps seen as something natural but not necessarily beautiful, and sometimes associated with wildness or lack of refinement. It was a time when the physical body took a back seat to the spiritual, laying a foundation that would influence European thought for centuries until new ideas began to emerge, stirring the embers of classical ideals back to life and setting the stage for a very different approach to beauty and the body. It's a reminder that what one era hides or ignores, another might bring into the light, creating a constantly shifting tapestry of human ideals. You've spent time shrouded in the spiritual contemplation of the Middle Ages, where the body was often seen as secondary, a mere vessel for the soul, largely hidden beneath fabric and rarely celebrated for its physical form alone. But history, like fashion trends, has a way of circling back, sometimes with a dramatic flourish. As you move out of the long, draped shadows of the medieval period and into the dazzling light of the Italian Renaissance, you feel a distinct shift in the air. It's like someone suddenly pulled back heavy velvet curtains and let the sunshine flood in. This era, roughly spanning from the 14th to the 16th centuries, is literally named the Rebirth, the Renaissance. And what was being reborn? A profound interest in the classical world, the very civilizations we explored back in Greece and Rome. Scholars, artists, and philosophers look back across the intervening centuries with fresh eyes, rediscovering ancient texts, examining ruined architecture, and crucially for our journey tonight, digging up and admiring classical sculptures. Imagine walking through Rome or Florence in the 15th century and seeing fragmented marble statues being unearthed, idealized forms, dynamic poses, muscles rendered with astonishing realism, or bodies depicted with serene, balanced proportions. After centuries where art primarily served religious narratives, often depicting figures in stiff poses or symbolic forms, these classical nudies were revolutionary. They spoke of a time when the human body was considered a worthy subject of study, a thing of beauty and perfection in itself, not just a container for the soul. This rediscovery of classical art and philosophy, which celebrated the human form and its potential, is a mainstream historical fact that fundamentally changed Western art and aesthetics. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael weren't just copying the ancients. They were inspired by them to look at the world and the human body with new intensity. They dissected corpses, often risking considerable social and religious disapproval, to understand anatomy, to know exactly how muscles attached to bone, how bodies moved, how light fell on skin. This anatomical study, driven by both scientific curiosity and artistic aspiration, was a hallmark of the Renaissance and led to incredibly lifelike and powerful depictions of the human form. You see figures like Michelangelo's David, standing proud and nude, a monumental celebration of physical perfection, a stark contrast to the robed saints of medieval cathedrals. This renewed focus on the body meant that ideals of physical beauty came back into vogue, albeit filtered through a Christian lens and the evolving social norms of the time. While overt, purely sensual depictions were still often tempered by religious context, the underlying appreciation for proportion, balance, and physical vitality was undeniable. What did the ideal Renaissance body look like? For women, a key ideal was softness and roundness, but perhaps with a slightly different emphasis than the purely fertility-linked medieval ideal. Renaissance painters often depicted women with gentle curves, ample bosoms, and rounded bellies. Think of Botticelli's Venus or Titian's Venus of Urbino. These figures are soft and beautiful, not necessarily thin. A pale complexion was highly prized. It indicated wealth and status, you weren't working outside in the sun, and purity. High foreheads were fashionable, sometimes achieved by plucking or shaving the hairline. For men, the ideal often involved muscularity and strength, reflecting the classical emphasis on heroic forms, but also tempered by Renaissance ideals of grace and intellectual prowess. A man should be strong, but also learned and refined. David embodies this. He's physically perfect, but the sculpture also captures a moment of tense intellectual calculation before action. Now, what about body hair? This is where the Renaissance gets interesting, drawing on classical ideas but also developing its own nuances. If you look at most Renaissance paintings and sculptures of nudes, whether male or female, they are overwhelmingly smooth. Michelangelo's David is virtually hairless below the head. Venus figures are depicted with perfectly smooth skin. This artistic convention likely stemmed directly from the classical sculptures they admired. Greek and Roman statues, even of male athletes or deities, often featured smooth bodies, reflecting an aesthetic preference for idealized form over rugged naturalism. Did this artistic ideal translate into real-life grooming practices? That's a good question, and harder to answer definitively. We know that depilatory techniques existed in the ancient world, as we discussed. Some medical and cosmetic texts from the Renaissance era do mention methods for removing hair, often using harsh-sounding concoctions involving things like arsenic, quicklime, or potent plant extracts. Imagine trying to make yourself look like a Botticelli Venus using a paste that sounds like it belongs in an alchemist's lab. You definitely wouldn't survive trying that recipe for silky smooth skin. It makes plucking your eyebrows seem positively tame by comparison. However, the extent to which these practices were widespread, particularly for large areas of the body, is unclear. Such treatments were likely painful, expensive, and potentially dangerous. They might have been primarily used by the wealthy elite, targeting visible areas like the face, eyebrows, upper lip, temple hairs to achieve that high forehead, or maybe the arms and legs if they were occasionally bared. Complete body hair removal for aesthetic reasons, like some depictions suggest, might have been more of an artistic ideal or a practice limited to specific contexts, perhaps like courtesans. A quirky tidbit from this era is the enduring popularity of depictions of Mary Magdalene. In many Renaissance paintings, she is shown as a beautiful woman, often with long, flowing hair, symbolizing her past vanity before repentance, but her body, if visible, is typically smooth. This ties into the idea of spiritual purity sometimes being visually represented by a clean, smooth form, connecting back to some medieval ideas of bodily discipline, but now merged with the Renaissance aesthetic of beauty. The emphasis on realistic anatomy in art also influenced how people thought about proportions. Artists developed systems of ideal proportions based on classical principles, often using mathematical ratios. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, illustrating the human body within a circle and square, is the most famous example. This wasn't just about drawing better. It was about seeing the human body as a microcosm of the universe, governed by harmonious mathematical principles. This spilled over into ideals of beauty. A beautiful body had correct, balanced proportions according to these emerging, often mathematically defined, standards. While artists were busy perfecting the ideal form on canvas and in marble, real people in the Renaissance were still dealing with the practicalities of life, including body hair. Fashion dictated what was visible. As clothing evolved, with more revealing necklines or sleeves that showed arms, the pressure to manage hair on these visible areas likely increased, at least for those who could afford the methods. Historians still argue whether the artistic ideals of the Renaissance, particularly regarding smooth, idealized bodies, were truly reflective of widespread beauty standards or were primarily aspirational, driven by elite artistic circles and a desire to emulate classical antiquity. Did the average person on the street in Florence expect everyone to be perfectly smooth like David? Or was that seen as a divine or heroic ideal? Was this level of hairlessness even achievable or desired by most people, given the limitations and dangers of the available depilatory methods? Our understanding is heavily influenced by the surviving visual art in texts from the period's educated elite. Furthermore, while the classical world was a huge influence, Renaissance ideas about beauty weren't just a straight copy. They were blended with Christian morality, new scientific understanding, anatomy, and the evolving social structures of city-states and kingdoms. The Renaissance body ideal was a complex mix of classical perfection, spiritual purity, and emerging secular ideas about human potential. The fascination with anatomy and realistic depiction also extended to capturing flaws and individual characteristics, although the dominant trend in high art was towards idealization, especially of figures like saints, classical deities, or powerful patrons. Portraits, however, could be more realistic, showing individuals with their actual features, though often presented in a flattering light. The Renaissance obsession with rediscovering and depicting the human form laid the groundwork for centuries of Western art and anatomical study. It brought the body back from the relative obscurity it had experienced in the medieval period, positioning it once again as a primary subject of beauty and scientific inquiry. The smooth, idealized figures of Renaissance art reinforced the idea that the human form, in its most perfect state, was free from excessive hair, a legacy passed down from classical sculpture that would continue to influence beauty standards in subtle and not-so-subtle ways in the centuries to come. It's a fascinating example of how looking backward can propel ideas forward, transforming how an entire civilization views itself in its physical being. You've left the sun-drenched studios of Renaissance artists in the idealized forms sculpted in marble, carrying with you the lingering scent of linseed oil and the quiet hum of rediscovered mathematical principles. Now, as you ease forward through the passage of time, you enter a period often called the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, roughly spanning the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a different kind of light filtering in now, less the radiant glow of rebirth, and more the cool, dissecting beam of rational inquiry. Think powdered wigs, elaborate corsets, men in silk breeches and stockings, and women with towering, often precarious, hairstyles adorned with ribbons and even miniature ships. Fashion in this era was less about revealing the natural form, or even an idealized version of it, and more about constructing an artificial one. Layers upon layers of fabric, padding, and structure created specific silhouettes. Wide hips and tiny waists for women, broad shoulders and shapely legs thanks to carefully fitted breeches for men. The body wasn't just a subject of art or science, it was a canvas for elaborate social performance. This was the era when science really started flexing its muscles, moving beyond the anatomical observations of the Renaissance into more systematic study. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant growth in anatomical knowledge and the increasing professionalization of medicine and surgery. Anatomical theaters, where dissections were performed publicly, sometimes quite dramatically, became centers of learning. Figures like William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, and scientists like Isaac Newton were revealing the underlying mathematical laws of the universe. The body in this rational view was often seen as a complex machine, understandable through mechanics and biology. How did this scientific, machine-like view of the body interact with the wildly artificial fashion and beauty standards? It's a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, scientists were meticulously documenting the body's internal workings, its bones, muscles, and organs. On the other hand, outward appearance was dominated by artifice. Wigs covered natural hair, sometimes elaborately styled and powdered white or gray. Faces were often heavily powdered with white lead, terrible for your skin, by the way. A true beauty is pain situation, though you definitely wouldn't survive using lead powder. And rouged. Beauty marks or patches made of silk or velvet were strategically placed on the face, sometimes even conveying coded messages. The focus of visible beauty shifted upwards, literally. With bodies encased in stiff, voluminous clothing, the face, neck, hands, and for men, their lower legs below the knee, became the primary areas for display and adornment. Cleavage could also be quite prominent in women's fashion. But even this was shaped and displayed within the confines of a structured gown and corset. So what about body hair in this era where surface was everything? With natural head hair often hidden under wigs, and most of the body concealed by clothing, the pressure to remove body hairs might seem reduced. However, the focus on smooth, unblemished skin for the visible areas remained, and arguably intensified. Think about those powdered faces. Blemishes were covered, skin was whitened, and the surface needed to be as smooth as possible to take the powder and paint. Facial hair, even fine velours hair, could interfere with this. While full beards and mustaches largely went out of fashion for men after the early 17th century, though smaller mustaches sometimes reappeared, the focus was on clean-shaven faces. Razors improved, and shaving became a standard part of male grooming. For women, the focus on the face meant eyebrows were particularly important. Following on from the Renaissance preference for high foreheads, women often plucked or shaved their eyebrows entirely. Yes, entirely. Why? Because thin, highly arched, or even completely absent eyebrows were considered fashionable, allowing for a larger expanse of pale forehead and enhancing the artificial, doll-like quality of the powdered face. Now for a truly quirky tidbit from this period that will make your own eyebrows raise in surprise, if you still have them. If you plucked your eyebrows off completely or they were naturally sparse, what did you do? You applied false eyebrows. And what were these fashionable little arches often made from? Mouse fur. Yes, you read that right. Little strips of mouse hide, sometimes glued on, sometimes attached with spirit gum to create the desired shape. Imagine the dedication to fashion required to sacrifice a mouse for your face. It's a bizarre little detail that perfectly captures the era's blend of artificiality and perhaps a touch of desperation in achieving the perfect look. The desire for smooth skin extended to other visible areas. Hands, often adorned with rings, needed to be smooth. The décolletage, when displayed, was meant to be a canvas of white, smooth skin. While full-body depilation wasn't a widespread documented practice for aesthetic reasons, unlike perhaps in specific contexts like courtesans mirroring the Renaissance possibilities, The focus on visible areas meant continued attention to removing unwanted hair there. Depilatory creams and pastes, similar to older recipes but perhaps with new ingredients from expanding global trade, likely existed, though they were often harsh and dangerous. Plucking and shaving remained the most common methods for smaller, accessible areas like the face and neck. The scientific study of anatomy, while revealing the body's internal structure, didn't necessarily lead to a greater appreciation for the body's natural state on the surface. If anything, the machine-like analogy might have reinforced the idea that the body was something to be manipulated, controlled, and improved upon, like oiling a mechanism or repainting a surface. The elaborate makeup, powder, and patches weren't about enhancing natural beauty. They were about creating an artificial ideal, one that was often miles away from the reality of natural skin texture or coloring, let alone hair. This period presents a fascinating question. Did the emphasis on artifice and surface beauty in the 17th and 18th centuries represent a turning away from the Renaissance ideal of natural, albeit perfected form, or was it simply a different kind of pursuit of an artificial perfection? Historians still argue whether the pervasive use of wigs, heavy makeup, and structured clothing indicated a rejection of the natural body or merely a cultural phase where the body was viewed primarily as a framework for social display and artistic embellishment, perhaps even linked to a desire for order and control that mirrored the scientific and political philosophies of the time. Was the smooth, powdered face with its artificial patches and eyebrows a continuation of the desire for a hairless ideal seen in classical and Renaissance art, translated through a filter of theatricality and artifice? The focus on visible areas also highlights how fashion dictates perceived problems with the body. When necklines are low, the neck and upper chest matter. When men wear breeches and stockings, their lower legs are on display. If fashion had dictated ankle-length robes for everyone, perhaps hair on the face and hands would have been less of a concern. The Age of Reason, ironically, showed how irrational the pursuit of beauty can be, involving lead paint, mouse fur, and uncomfortable structures, all in service of an ever-changing, often bizarre, ideal. The underlying anatomical knowledge, while fascinating in itself, seemed to exist in a separate sphere from the performance of beauty. Knowing how a muscle worked didn't stop you from lacing yourself into a corset that redistributed your organs. Understanding skin as an organ didn't deter you from slathering it in toxic white powder. The body as studied was a biological entity. The body as presented was a social construct, painted, powdered, and padded into the approved shape. This era of powdered artifice and scientific dissection sets the stage for new ideas about health, hygiene, and naturalness that will begin to emerge as we move into the 19th century. The elaborate artificial body ideal couldn't last forever, and the pendulum would eventually swing back towards a different kind of naturalness, though still filtered through the lens of evolving social norms and scientific understanding. The mouse fur eyebrows, thankfully, wouldn't make a widespread comeback, but the legacy of focusing on visible areas in the pursuit of smooth skin, particularly on the face, would continue in new forms. Leaving behind the glittering powdered world of the 18th century, where artifice reigned supreme and mouse fur eyebrows were a genuine fashion choice, still hard to believe, right? You glide forward into a new era. The air changes, perhaps smelling faintly of coal smoke from the burgeoning factories, alongside the less romantic aroma of inadequate sanitation that still plagued many cities. This is the 19th century, the Victorian era, a time of immense change, rapid industrialization, scientific leaps, and a curious blend of strict social codes and hidden anxieties. Imagine stepping onto a bustling street in London or Paris. Carriages rattle by, people in more sober, structured clothing hurry along. The pace of life feels faster, driven by the hum of machinery and the relentless march of progress. While the previous century built elaborate facades on the body, the 19th century started to look inwards, focusing on health, hygiene, and a different kind of natural beauty, albeit one still heavily dictated by convention. The mainstream historical fact shaping this period is the significant advancement in understanding disease and the rise of public health movements. Figures like John Snow mapping cholera outbreaks in London and later the widespread, though not universally accepted, embrace of germ theory, thanks to Pasteur and Lister, began to transform how people thought about cleanliness and the body. Hygiene wasn't just about looking presentable, it was increasingly linked to health and preventing illness. This led to a greater emphasis on regular bathing, though still not a daily ritual for everyone, clean clothing and efforts, often patchy and class-dependent, to improve sanitation in homes and cities. This newfound or perhaps renewed focus on cleanliness had a direct impact on beauty standards. Pale skin remained desirable, suggesting a life of leisure away from manual labor in the sun, but the heavy lead-based powders of the previous century were starting to be viewed with suspicion, not just for their toxicity, but perhaps for their overt artificiality. The ideal was a healthy pallor, perhaps achieved with less visible cosmetics like rice powder or through careful avoidance of the sun. Cleanliness became synonymous with beauty, and crucially in this era with moral virtue and respectability. An unblemished complexion wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it suggested a well-ordered life, free from the squalor associated with poverty and perceived moral decay. The dominant body shape for women in this era was famously created by the corset. While corsets had been around for centuries, the Victorian ideal pushed them to new extremes, aiming for a tiny waist, a full bust, and pronounced curving hips. This created the iconic S-bend silhouette, where the torso curved sharply back, pushing the bust forward and the hips back. This shape wasn't natural by any stretch of the imagination. It dramatically redistributed internal organs and was undeniably restrictive. Yet paradoxically, it was often discussed in terms of promoting health and support, a far cry from the open theatricality of the previous century's shaping garments. It shows how easily the idea of health can be co-opted by prevailing fashion demands, promising a virtuous outcome for what was essentially aesthetic manipulation. Now, what about body hair in this context of hygiene, health, and structured femininity? For men, the 19th century saw a glorious resurgence of facial hair. After the mostly clean-shaven and wigged centuries, beards, mustaches, and sideburns grew in popularity, becoming symbols of masculinity, wisdom, and respectability. Imagine the relief of men who no longer had to meticulously shave every morning or wear itchy wigs. Okay, maybe a light joke about men celebrating their facial freedom after centuries of smooth chins. There was even a fringe belief that beards could act as a filter, protecting the wearer from airborne diseases in polluted cities. A quirky tidbit that links this fashion choice directly to the era's health anxieties, even if the science was questionable. For women, however, the situation was different. The ideal of smooth, blemish-free skin remained, especially on visible areas like the face, neck, arms, when fashion allowed, and hands. With high necklines becoming more common in daytime wear, perhaps less décolletage was on display than in the 18th century, but the face remained a primary focus. Any unwanted hair on a woman's face was considered deeply unfeminine and a source of significant anxiety. Peach fuzz was one thing, but darker, more noticeable hair on the upper lip, chin, or cheeks was often seen as a blight. This anxiety about unwanted hair was amplified by some of the emerging, often questionable, pseudoscientific ideas of the time. There was a small, fringe current of thought that linked excessive hairiness in women to a lack of femininity, or even to atavism, the idea that a person was reverting to a more primitive state, closer to animal ancestors. Imagine the horror of being told your slight mustache meant you were devolving. This was a deeply unsettling thought in an era so preoccupied with progress and refinement. This linking of body hair to masculine traits or degeneracy is a particularly quirky and rather unpleasant tidbit from the darker corners of Victorian thought about the body. The desire to remove unwanted hair led to a variety of methods, often discussed in health, beauty, or even early medical guides aimed at women. Plucking remained common for small areas. Shaving was generally considered too coarse and masculine for women's faces. Depilatory creams and liquids were sold, but like their predecessors, they were often harsh, based on chemicals like sulfur, lime, or even ammonia, a painful prospect. Some recipes were home-brewed using ingredients like quicklime and arsenic. Beauty was still pain, and sometimes fatal pain. The quest for smooth skin was serious business, fraught with risk. There was also the advent of electrolysis towards the end of the century, initially developed for medical purposes, like removing ingrown eyelashes, but quickly adopted for cosmetic hair removal. This was a slow, painstaking, and expensive process, involving inserting a needle into each hair follicle and applying an electric current to destroy it. While more permanent than creams or plucking, it was inaccessible to most and likely quite uncomfortable. The growing market for beauty products and advice in the Victorian era meant that women were constantly bombarded with information about how to achieve the ideal appearance, and removing unwanted hair was a recurring theme. These guides, though not always explicitly sex manuals, certainly addressed aspects of the body considered important for attractiveness and marriageability. They reinforced the idea that feminine beauty required a smooth, hairless canvas, at least on the visible areas. The juxtaposition of the era's increasing scientific knowledge about anatomy and health with these sometimes bizarre beauty practices is striking. Doctors were learning more about the body's functions, yet fashion and social pressures still dictated painful and potentially harmful alterations like extreme corsetry and applying corrosive chemicals to the skin. It highlights a recurring theme. Medical knowledge doesn't always trump cultural ideals when it comes to how we treat our bodies. Historians still argue whether the pervasive Victorian focus on hygiene and cleanliness was primarily a response to genuine public health crises and emerging germ theory, or if it was just as much, or even more, about reinforcing social stratification and moral values. Was insisting on cleanliness a way for the rising middle class to distinguish itself from the dirty working class? And how did this play into the obsession with smooth, pure skin for women? Did the anxiety about body hair stem from a medical concern, however misguided, or a deeply ingrained social fear of anything that challenged rigid definitions of femininity? The Victorian period, for all its apparent prudishness, laid groundwork for many modern anxieties about appearance. The link between cleanliness, health, and beauty became firmly established. The idea that certain forms of body hair, particularly on women, were undesirable or even indicative of negative traits gained traction. While sex manuals, as we might recognize them, were still relatively rare or clandestine, the health, beauty, and etiquette guides of the era certainly policed the body, setting standards for what was considered attractive and respectable. As you drift through this era of steam engines, strict etiquette, and hidden anxieties, you see how the body, despite being increasingly understood scientifically, remained a battleground for social expectations and the relentless pursuit of an often uncomfortable ideal. The focus shifted from the overtly artificial structures of the 18th century to a more insidious form of control, one that linked beauty, health, and morality in ways that would continue to influence body standards for decades to come. The smooth, pale skin ideal persisted, now reinforced by notions of hygiene and femininity that left little room for unwanted hair. The heavy velvet curtain of the Victorian era begins to lift, and you step out of the hushed parlors and gaslit streets into the brighter, faster-paced dawn of the 20th century. The air feels different, perhaps cleaner in some places due to incremental urban improvements, but also buzzing with a new kind of energy. The stiff, whalebone-reinforced posture of the previous age starts to loosen, replaced by a slightly more relaxed, though still constrained, bearing. The S-bend silhouette softens, the massive sleeves inflate for a time, and then, subtly at first, fashion starts to streamline. Imagine the shift. Skirts slowly creep upwards from the floor, revealing ankles, then calves. Sleeves shorten, exposing more of the arm. These changes, seemingly small, would have profound consequences for what was considered visible on the body and therefore what needed to conform to the prevailing beauty standards. While the face and hands had always been on display, areas like the lower leg and the underarm were now entering the public eye. The mainstream historical fact that defines this transition is the explosive growth of the modern cosmetic and beauty industry, coupled with the rise of mass-market advertising. This wasn't just about selling pretty bottles. It was about creating and marketing ideals, identifying problems people didn't know they had, and offering solutions. Department stores became cathedrals of consumerism, their counters laden with powders, creams, perfumes, and, crucially, new products designed to alter or remove hair. Magazines increasingly targeting women became vehicles for these advertisements, spreading images and ideas of the ideal female form and face across a wider population than ever before. This era saw the emergence of names that would become titans of the beauty world: Helena Rubinstein, Elizabeth Arden, later figures like Max Factor. These weren't just chemists or pharmacists, they were entrepreneurs and marketers who understood the power of image and aspiration. They sold more than just products. They sold the promise of beauty, youth, and social acceptance. And as fashion changed, revealing more skin, unwanted hair on these newly visible areas became a prime target for this burgeoning industry. Think about the shift in dress. By the 1910s, sleeveless and sheer-sleeve gowns were becoming popular for evening wear. The armpit, previously hidden away in opaque fabric, was now sometimes on display. For a society still clinging to notions of smooth, pure femininity, particularly for the middle and upper classes who were the initial targets of this marketing, visible underarm hair on a woman was simply not acceptable. It was deemed unhygienic, tying into the Victorian legacy of cleanliness anxieties, remember? Unfeminine and unsightly. One particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the story often cited about the introduction of the first widely marketed women's razor. Gillette, having dominated the men's razor market, introduced the Milady Décolleté razor around 1915, explicitly marketed to women for removing underarm hair in response to the popularity of sleeveless dresses. An advertisement from Harper's Bazaar in 1915 declared, "The well-groomed woman of today must have smooth underarms if she is to wear the sheer fabrics and the exquisite gowns contemporary fashions demand." This wasn't a slow evolution of norms. It was a direct, commercially driven campaign linking a specific fashion trend to a newly defined bodily flaw, requiring a specific gendered solution. It highlights how quickly the industry could capitalize on and amplify changing standards. Before this, while some women might have plucked or used messy depilatories, shaving wasn't a widespread practice for women's body hair. This was a deliberate marketing push to create a new grooming habit. The methods for hair removal diversified, driven by market demand. Chemical depilatories continued to be sold, often slightly refined from their harsher Victorian predecessors, but still capable of causing skin irritation or burns. These were presented as a more feminine alternative to shaving, less likely to cause stubble, a major concern, presented as proof that shaving was unsuitable for women. Electrolysis was still an option for those who could afford it, a slow and often painful process offered in early beauty salons or by electrologists. X-ray hair removal also appeared, a dangerously misguided method that promised permanent removal, but caused severe burns, skin damage, and increased cancer risk, a truly alarming example of unregulated beauty treatments in the early 20th century. Imagine willingly exposing yourself to radiation for smooth legs. Thankfully, that didn't survive long, but it shows the desperation the standards could create. But the most significant method shift was the introduction and eventual normalization of the safety razor for women. Marketing focused on ease, speed, and convenience, compared to messy creams or painful plucking. The association with masculinity had to be overcome, and this was done by gendering the product itself. The Milady Décolleté razor wasn't just a smaller 1920s and onwards. Legs became another area of focus. While sheer stockings could obscure hair to some extent, bare legs, for sports or swimming, and the desire for completely smooth legs became increasingly promoted. The depilatory and razor industries quickly pivoted to target this new area, creating a double burden of expected hairlessness: underarms and legs. Sex manuals, or rather the guides that touched upon intimacy and appearance, often wrapped in discussions of health, marriage, or personal hygiene, started to reflect these shifting standards. While explicit discussion of body hair in the context of sexual attractiveness might have been less common in mass-market publications than in modern times, the broader cultural pressure to be clean, smooth, and feminine certainly influenced how women presented themselves, both publicly and privately. A woman internalizing the message that visible body hair was unfeminine or unhygienic would likely carry that standard into her intimate life. The focus in these guides remained largely on the female body, reinforcing the idea that women were the primary subjects of aesthetic scrutiny and required constant management of their physical appearance to remain desirable. Male body hair wasn't typically discussed as something to be removed, reflecting the lingering association of hairiness with masculinity and strength. Historians still argue whether the beauty industry was the primary driver of these new hair removal norms, essentially manufacturing a demand, or if they were simply responding to already changing social anxieties and fashion trends that naturally exposed more skin. Was it a top-down imposition by corporations, or a bottom-up adoption by women eager to embrace modernity and new styles? The truth is likely a complex interplay, with the industry seizing the opportunity presented by fashion shifts to create lucrative new markets, and women navigating these pressures within their social and cultural context. The proliferation of beauty advice in magazines and through advertising created a continuous feedback loop. Women saw images of smooth-skinned models, read articles extolling the virtues of hairless limbs, and were presented with a growing array of products to achieve this look. The standard of smooth skin wasn't just about aesthetics. It became intertwined with notions of youth, cleanliness, and modernity. The modern woman of the early 20th century, as portrayed in advertising, was increasingly smooth-skinned. The transition from the Victorian era to the early 20th century highlights how rapidly beauty standards could change, driven by a confluence of factors: evolving fashion, technological advancements, like the safety razor, and crucially, the strategic power of a burgeoning commercial industry eager to identify and capitalize on new markets. The subtle unveiling of the body by fashion created a canvas for the beauty industry to define new areas requiring improvement, transforming previously unseen or unremarked upon body hair into a problem that demanded a commercial solution. As you drift through the sights and sounds of this era, the clatter of early automobiles, the jazz music starting to play, the rustle of looser dresses, you see the foundations being laid for many of the beauty expectations that persist today. The idea that women's bodies, particularly legs and underarms, should be smooth and hairless became firmly entrenched, not just as a personal preference, but as a widely promoted, commercially reinforced standard. The journey from hidden, unremarked hair to a target for razors and creams was remarkably swift, propelled by the forces of consumerism and changing visual culture. This era solidified the commercial imperative behind body hair removal, setting the stage for its further evolution throughout the rest of the century. As the early 20th century rolls on, the pace seems to quicken even more. The relative freedom of the 1920s gives way to the economic hardship of the Great Depression, and then the looming shadow of global conflict. And just like everything else, beauty standards and grooming habits were swept up in these massive societal shifts. You've seen the foundation laid in the previous decades, the beauty industry re-identifying problems, fashion revealing more skin, and new technologies offering solutions. Now, things are about to escalate, driven by something as seemingly unconnected as a global war and a fabric shortage. The mainstream historical fact that dramatically impacted female grooming during this period is the advent of World War II and, specifically, the rationing of resources, including silk and its popular replacement, nylon. For many women in the decades leading up to the war, wearing stockings was the norm. Legs were often covered either by skirts that reached below the knee or by opaque stockings. While hair removal on legs was becoming more common, especially for those who adopted shorter skirts or wore swimwear, it wasn't the universal expectation it would become. But when the war effort demanded materials like nylon for parachutes and military supplies, stockings for civilians became scarce. Suddenly, women were going bare-legged more often than ever before, and with bare legs came increased visibility of leg hair. Imagine the shift. Previously, your legs might only be fully visible at the beach or during specific activities, but now you're walking down the street, going to work, attending events with bare legs because you simply couldn't get stockings. This created a new cultural moment, and the beauty industry, ever opportunistic, was quick to seize it. They weren't about to let this problem go to waste. Shaving, which had been marketed to women for underarms, was now heavily promoted as the practical, patriotic solution for leg hair. Advertisements linked smooth legs not just to beauty, but to cleanliness and being put together, even in times of hardship. You couldn't wear stockings? Fine, just shave. It was presented as a simple, effective way to maintain a feminine appearance when traditional methods of leg coverage were unavailable. This wasn't just about utility, it was deeply intertwined with the visual culture of the era, particularly the rise of the wartime pinup. Think of those iconic images: Betty Grable, Rita Hayworth, Veronica Lake. Sent to soldiers overseas and popular on the home front, these pinups presented an idealized version of the American woman. And a key feature of this ideal? Smooth, often seemingly endless. Legs and flawlessly smooth underarms. The pinup wasn't just a morale booster, it was a powerful disseminator of beauty norms. Soldiers dreamed of the smooth-skinned girl next door, and women back home saw what was being presented as the standard of attractiveness. The visibility of bare, smooth legs in these widely distributed images reinforced the idea that this was the desirable state. It created a feedback loop. Nylon shortages made bare legs necessary, advertising pushed shaving as a solution, and pinup culture cemented smooth legs as an aesthetic ideal linked to femininity and desirability. One particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from this era relates to the lengths women went to mimic the look of stockings when they couldn't get them. Some women would draw a line down the back of their legs with eyebrow pencil to simulate the seam of a stocking. This highlights just how entrenched the look of stockings, and by extension, the expectation of a certain kind of leg appearance had become. It wasn't just about covering up, it was about presenting a specific visual, and the absence of stockings emphasized what was underneath. If you were going to draw a fake seam, you certainly didn't want that fake stocking look marred by visible hair. The pressure wasn't just commercial, there was a social element too. Magazines and etiquette guides discussed the proper appearance for women, and going bare-legged meant your natural state was more exposed to scrutiny. While rationing was a necessity, maintaining personal appearance was often framed as a way for women on the home front to contribute to morale, looking good for their husbands, boyfriends, or just generally upholding standards in a chaotic world. Shaving became integrated into this narrative of maintaining normalcy and femininity during wartime. So you have this perfect storm: a practical reason for legs to be uncovered, nylon shortage; a commercial solution readily available, razors and creams; and a powerful visual medium reinforcing the desired outcome, pinups. The idea of habitually shaving legs, which was relatively new and confined to specific contexts before the war, became widespread and normalized for middle-class women during this period. Sex manuals and relationship guides of the era, while still often focusing on broader themes of marital harmony, hygiene, and reproductive health, would have operated within this cultural context. While they might not have dedicated chapters specifically to leg hair, the prevailing standards of female appearance were implicit. Discussions about maintaining attractiveness for one's spouse would naturally include adhering to the widely accepted norms of grooming. If smooth legs and underarms were being promoted everywhere else as the standard of femininity and desirability, it's highly probable this filtered into expectations within intimate relationships, even if not explicitly dictated by these guides. The personal became intertwined with the cultural. The focus remained overwhelmingly on the female body. While wartime might have seen some men adopt new grooming habits, particularly those in service, shaving body hair below the neck was still not the norm for men. The wartime ideal for men was often rugged and capable, and while cleanliness was valued, hairless legs weren't part of that image. This further solidified body hair removal as a gendered expectation, primarily placed upon women. The methods of hair removal evolved slightly during this period, but remained largely the same types. Shaving, chemical depilatories, still sometimes harsh; waxing, becoming more accessible in salons; and electrolysis for those seeking more permanent solutions, though still expensive and slow. The wartime focus was primarily on the speed and convenience of shaving, aligning with the practical needs of women juggling work, home, and wartime responsibilities. The effectiveness of the marketing campaign was evident in how quickly shaving became a routine for millions of women. What started as a response to a specific textile shortage quickly morphed into a deeply ingrained grooming habit. The problem of leg hair, which hadn't been a major focus in previous eras, was now firmly on the beauty agenda, and the solution was clear: remove it. Historians still argue whether the wartime nylon shortage was a decisive factor in normalizing leg shaving for women, or if it merely accelerated a trend that was already underway due to fashion and the burgeoning beauty industry. Was it a unique historical moment that created the standard, or did it just push an existing trend over the edge into mass adoption? It's likely a combination. The economic pressures and social shifts of the 1930s and 40s certainly created fertile ground for new norms to take hold quickly, and the sudden necessity of bare legs provided the perfect opportunity for the industry to capitalize on and solidify the idea of smooth legs as a must-have. The legacy of this wartime period is significant. The habit of shaving legs became widespread and normalized for a generation of women. As the post-war era dawned and nylon stockings became readily available again, the smooth leg standard didn't disappear. It had been established and reinforced so thoroughly that it stuck. The wartime necessity transformed into a post-war expectation. Think about the women who lived through this. They adapted to bare legs out of necessity, were told by magazines and ads that shaving was the answer, saw images of smooth-legged pinups everywhere, and incorporated shaving into their routine. By the time nylon returned, many had internalized the idea that smooth legs were simply how a woman's legs should look. It was no longer just about mimicking stockings, it was about the state of the leg itself. This era shows how quickly cultural standards can shift when multiple factors align: economic, technological, and visual. The beauty industry didn't just sell products. They successfully sold a narrative about what constituted desirable femininity, leveraging wartime conditions to make a specific grooming practice seem essential and appealing. As you imagine the swing music playing, the newsreels showing distant battles, and women working in factories or volunteering, you see the smooth leg emerging as a new, powerful symbol of female beauty, forged partly out of practical necessity and heavily shaped by commercial interest and pervasive visual culture. The seed planted in the early 20th century, that visible body hair on women was undesirable, was watered and grew into a deeply rooted expectation during this tumultuous period. The journey from a skirt reaching the ankle to the widespread practice of leg shaving happened remarkably fast, accelerated by the unique pressures of wartime. And with smooth legs and underarms now firmly established as ideals, the focus of the beauty industry and societal expectations would continue to evolve, ever finding new areas of the body to manage and improve. So you've just lived through the war years, adapting to bare legs out of necessity, bombarded by images of smooth-skinned pinups, and integrating shaving into your routine as a symbol of feminine upkeep. Nylon stockings might be making a comeback as manufacturing pivots back to civilian goods, but the smooth leg standard you adopted isn't going anywhere. It's become habit, a part of what you now understand it means to be a well-groomed woman. But history, it seems, rarely lets things settle for long, especially when it comes to fashion and the ever-hungry beauty industry. As the world breathes a collective sigh of relief after the war, a new kind of explosion is about to happen, a fashion explosion on the beaches and by the pools. The post-war era, particularly the late 1940s and into the 1950s, sees prosperity returning to many Western nations. People have more leisure time, more disposable income, and a renewed interest in recreation, including swimming and sunbathing. Swimwear, which had been relatively modest through the early 20th century, is about to undergo a radical transformation. The mainstream historical fact here is the introduction and gradual acceptance of the bikini, often credited to French designer Louis Réard in 1946. While two-piece swimsuits existed before, the bikini was revolutionary in its minimal coverage. It was described as smaller than the world's smallest swimsuit and named after the Bikini Atoll nuclear test site, suggesting its explosive impact. Réard reportedly struggled to find a model willing to wear it, eventually hiring a nude dancer. This tells you something about how scandalous it was perceived to be at the time. Imagine standing on a beach in the late 1940s. Up until now, most women's swimsuits were closer to full dresses or shorts and tops. covering the midriff and often featuring skirts or panels. Now suddenly there are swimsuits that consist of little more than two triangles of fabric connected by strings. It exposes the navel, a previously taboo area in public fashion, and significantly higher portions of the thighs and hips. This new minimal swimwear threw a spotlight on areas of the body that hadn't previously been subject to public scrutiny in the same way. If the rise of shorter skirts and sleeveless dresses had driven the focus to legs and underarms, the bikini pushed that boundary further south. You might have perfected your leg and underarm shaving routine, but now you're faced with the prospect of pubic hair potentially being visible outside the lines of your swimsuit bottom. The beauty industry, always eager to identify a new problem it could sell you a solution for, quickly adapted. Just as they marketed razors for underarms and legs, they began to suggest that the area around the bikini line also needed attention. Advertisements didn't necessarily feature explicit images, but they would use euphemisms, talking about achieving a smooth line or preventing embarrassing moments in your new swimsuit. The pressure wasn't just from ads, it was visual. As images of women in these daring new swimsuits proliferated in magazines and films, the expectation of managing hair in the bikini area began to take hold, at least for those who adopted this more revealing fashion. It's important to remember that the adoption of the bikini and bikini line grooming wasn't instant or universal. In the years immediately following its introduction, the bikini was considered extremely risque and was banned on beaches in many countries, including Spain, Italy, and even some parts of the United States. Its acceptance was slow, filtering in first through European resorts and avant-garde fashion circles before gaining wider traction in the 1950s and especially the 1960s. So while some women were immediately confronting this new grooming challenge, others were still wearing more modest suits and perhaps weren't directly impacted by this particular pressure yet. However, the trend towards less coverage in swimwear was undeniable. Even if you weren't wearing a full bikini, swimsuits in general were becoming more streamlined and fitted, often cut higher on the leg than before. This incremental reduction in fabric meant that the potential for pubic hair to be visible outside the suit's boundaries increased for a growing number of women. The beauty industry capitalized on this broader trend, not just the specific rise of the bikini. They weren't just selling hair removal, they were selling confidence. The confidence to wear the latest swimwear without worrying about visible hair. The methods for bikini line hair removal were essentially the same ones being used for legs and underarms. Shaving waxing, which was becoming more popular in salons, though still painful and expensive. And chemical depilatories, still sometimes unreliable and irritating. Shaving was, again, the most accessible and affordable option for most women to tackle this new area. It was quick, could be done at home, and fit seamlessly into the existing routine of leg and underarm shaving. This expansion of the grooming expectations southward wasn't just about practicality, it was linked to evolving ideas about female sexuality and the body. The post-war era saw complex shifts, a return to traditional gender roles in some ways, but also increasing visibility of female bodies in popular culture. The glamour of Hollywood stars, the rising popularity of magazines like Playboy, founded in 1953, though initially focused more on nude photography than explicit sexual instruction, and the general loosening of certain social strictures all contributed to a climate where the female body and its presentation was under increasing cultural scrutiny and objectification. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the resistance in outright bans the bikini faced. The fact that it was considered so shocking and potentially immoral highlights how deeply ingrained the idea of covering the lower body, particularly the pubic area, had been. The very act of revealing this area, even the edges, was a challenge to existing social norms and immediately prompted discussions, both prudish and titillating, about what lay beneath the fabric. This shock value was part of what the beauty industry leveraged. If the swimsuit itself was controversial, surely making sure your body met the standards for wearing it was paramount. Some early bikini wearers were reportedly even fined by police for indecency on certain beaches. Sex manuals and relationship guides of this era, while still relatively conservative compared to later decades, were also navigating this changing landscape. They continued to emphasize hygiene and appearance as part of maintaining marital harmony and attracting one's spouse. While explicit discussion of pubic hair removal in intimate contexts was likely still uncommon or couched in very discreet terms, the broader cultural pressure around bikini line grooming would have subtly influenced expectations. If society was deeming visible pubic hair outside a swimsuit undesirable, this aesthetic preference would inevitably filter into personal and intimate spheres. A guide discussing female attractiveness might encourage women to keep up with modern grooming standards, which by the late 1950s increasingly included attention to this area. The connection between public fashion and private expectations is a recurring theme here. What begins as a pressure driven by swimwear on the beach gradually becomes an internalized standard for how a woman's body should look, regardless of whether she's wearing a bikini or not. The idea of having a smooth, neat bikini line moved from being about avoiding potential embarrassment in public to being an expected part of female hygiene and attractiveness in private. This period also solidified the gendered nature of body hair removal. While some men might shave their chests for bodybuilding or swimming, it was not a widespread social expectation. The focus remained firmly on the female body as the site requiring constant management and alteration to meet evolving beauty standards. The ideal male body in popular culture still tended to be more rugged and naturally hairy, reinforcing the contrast with the increasingly smooth female ideal. The expansion of hair removal beyond legs and underarms to the bikini area represents a significant step in the commodification of female bodies. The beauty industry successfully created a new problem and a new market by linking the visibility of pubic hair, or even the potential visibility, to shame or unattractiveness. This wasn't about health or hygiene in any objective sense. It was purely about aesthetics dictated by changing fashion. Historians still argue whether the bikini was the primary cause of the increased focus on pubic hair removal, or if it was simply a highly visible symptom of broader societal shifts towards revealing clothing and the growing power of the beauty industry to dictate standards across the entire female form. Was it the suit that demanded the grooming, or was the trend towards more grooming ready to seize on the suit as its new frontier? It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, but what's clear is that the two developments were powerfully intertwined, each fueling the other. The daring nature of the bikini made any visible hair outside its minimal bounds seem particularly prominent, thereby increasing the perceived need for removal. Think about the ripple effect. The bikini wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a cultural phenomenon that challenged norms and opened up new possibilities for both self-expression and external judgment. For women navigating this era, deciding whether to wear a bikini and then deciding how to manage their bodies to feel comfortable or feel they should feel comfortable in one became part of the negotiation of modern womanhood. The methods of hair removal saw incremental improvements. Waxes became slightly less painful, depilatories slightly less harsh, but no major technological breakthroughs in this period. The focus remained on readily available, repeatable methods like shaving and waxing, solidifying the idea that hair removal was an ongoing, necessary maintenance task, not a one-time event. As you picture the sunny beaches of the 1950s, the colorful, albeit scandalously small, bikinis, and the advertisements subtly hinting at the need for a smooth line, you see how fashion continues to be a major driver of beauty standards in grooming practices. The wartime necessity of smooth legs transitions seamlessly into the post-war aesthetic demand for managed bikini lines. The area of the female body deemed acceptable to display without hair continues to expand, pushed by the edges of swimwear and the persistent narrative that less body hair equals more attractiveness. And this expansion, driven by public appearance, slowly but surely infiltrates the private expectations discussed in intimate guides of the era. The beauty ideal is becoming increasingly smooth, increasingly managed, and extending its reach into ever more intimate parts of the body. The foundation laid in the early 20th century, that body hair on women is undesirable, is being built upon layer by layer, era by era, with each new fashion trend and societal shift providing the scaffolding for the next stage of expectation and exploitation. The road to managing every conceivable hair on the female form is well underway, and the bikini boom was a significant milestone on that journey. As the 1950s mellowed into the 1960s, the world seemed to spin a little faster, colors became bolder, and the air felt charged with change. You're living through a period often romanticized as the swinging 60s, a time of supposed liberation, cultural revolution, and questioning of established norms. Music is evolving rapidly, civil rights movements are gaining momentum, and traditional social structures are being challenged on multiple fronts. It feels like everything is up for grabs, including, perhaps surprisingly, ideas about the human body and how it should be presented. On one hand, you have the burgeoning counterculture and the hippie movement. This group, often advocating for peace, love, and a return to nature, tended to reject many of the mainstream beauty standards and consumerist pressures. They championed natural hair, whether on the head or elsewhere, viewing it as a symbol of freedom from societal constraints and artificiality. The ideal was often a more unaltered appearance, embracing what grew naturally rather than conforming to dictates of smoothness or neatness imposed by fashion magazines and the beauty industry. You might see women with long, flowing hair, wearing loose, natural fabrics, and generally looking like they hadn't spent hours painstakingly grooming themselves. This was a powerful counter-narrative to the polished, sometimes rigid look of the previous decade. But on the other hand, the mainstream fashion world was undergoing its own revolution, one that put even more of the female body on display. The miniskirt, arguably the most iconic fashion trend of the 1960s, exploded onto the scene, popularized by designers like Mary Quant in London. Suddenly, hemlines that had hovered modestly around the knee or lower throughout the 1950s were shooting up the thigh, sometimes stopping startlingly high. This fashion shift had an immediate and dramatic impact on the visibility of legs. If the shorter skirts of the 1920s had driven initial leg shaving, the miniskirts of the 1960s made displaying smooth legs almost mandatory for participating in this vibrant, youthful style. Imagine pulling on a miniskirt for the first time. Your legs, from mid-thigh down, are fully exposed to the world in a way they haven't been before, at least not in everyday public wear. Any hair on those legs would be immediately visible, and in the context of this new, sleek, modern look, it was increasingly seen as incongruous. The cultural pressure to have smooth legs intensified dramatically. It wasn't just about looking neat. It was about looking modern, youthful, and fashionable. The miniskirt, while a symbol of freedom and youthful rebellion against older, more restrictive styles, paradoxically reinforced and amplified the existing pressure to remove leg hair. And it wasn't just legs. Swimwear continued to become more daring, and sleeveless dresses and tops remained popular, keeping the pressure on underarms. The bikini, though still controversial in some circles, was becoming more widely accepted, solidifying the expectation of managing the bikini line, as we discussed last time. The miniskirt simply added another very prominent area to the list of places that should be smooth. It's like history whispered, just when you thought it was safe to grow back that little patch. This era also saw improvements and increased accessibility in hair removal methods beyond the basic razor. While shaving remained the most common and affordable option, waxing and chemical depilatories started to gain more traction with the average woman. Professional waxing services were becoming more widely available in salons, no longer just the domain of actresses or the wealthy. Home waxing kits also began to appear, promising longer-lasting smoothness than shaving, albeit often with significant pain and mess. Trying to rip hair out of your leg with a strip of cloth and hot wax in your bathroom felt like a DIY torture session, often leaving behind sticky residue, bruises, and the distinct feeling that you just auditioned for a slapstick comedy involving honey and regret. But oh, the promise of weeks of smoothness. Chemical depilatories also improved slightly, becoming marginally less likely to cause chemical burns, though they still often smelled awful and could irritate sensitive skin. These offered an alternative for those who dislike shaving or waxing, using chemicals to dissolve the hair at the skin's surface. The marketing for these products emphasized convenience and a perceived, gentler result than cutting the hair with a blade. However, the pungent smell of these creams was often a dead giveaway that you just used one, leaving a scent trail like a slightly off-putting science experiment gone wrong. You could practically hear the hair screaming as it dissolved. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant rise in popularity and availability of waxing and depilatory creams as viable alternatives or supplements to shaving during the 1960s. This wasn't a new invention, but the combination of increased disposable income, wider salon services, home kit availability, and the intense pressure from fashion trends like the miniskirt created a perfect storm for these methods to move beyond niche use into the broader market of female grooming. So you're caught between these two poles, the cultural siren call of naturalism and rejecting conformity from the hippie movement, and the undeniable visual imperative of the miniskirt in mainstream fashion pushing for sleek, smooth legs. Which path do you choose? Do you embrace your body hair as a form of rebellion against beauty standards, aligning with the counterculture? Or do you conform to the dominant fashion trend, diligently shaving, waxing, or dissolving the hair on your legs and underarms and bikini line to feel confident and current in your miniskirt? This tension highlights the complex nature of liberation in the 1960s. Was it truly liberating if it just swapped one set of expectations for another, or created new ones based on fashion trends? Sex manuals and relationship guides from this era, reflecting the societal shifts, might have started to address these changing grooming habits, though likely with varying degrees of directness. While many guides remained focused on traditional roles and hygiene, some might touch on appearance in the context of pleasing a partner. With the increased visibility of legs and the general cultural conversation around naturalism versus grooming, discussions about body hair might appear, perhaps framed in terms of personal preference or what is considered attractive by the evolving standards. Some guides might subtly endorse the smoother look as part of maintaining a youthful or modern appearance, while others might implicitly acknowledge the natural option, though it was likely still considered less conventional within mainstream advice. The idea of grooming as a personal choice, rather than a strict obligation, might begin to surface, though the societal pressure remains strong. The quirky or fringe tidbit of this era could be the various, sometimes bizarre, home remedies or electric devices marketed for hair removal. While electric epilators were invented earlier, they started to become more refined, though still incredibly painful, in the 60s. Imagine strapping a device to your leg that promised to pluck multiple hairs at once. It felt less like grooming and more like a medieval torture device designed by someone who hated legs. These devices were often expensive and notoriously uncomfortable, making them a fringe option for most. But their existence shows the fervent desire for more permanent or longer-lasting solutions beyond daily shaving. There were also perpetual rumors and ads for things like sugar waxing, an ancient technique gaining renewed interest, or DIY chemical concoctions, highlighting how desperate people were for alternatives that weren't razors. This period really crystallizes the paradox of freedom versus conformity when it comes to beauty standards. The 60s were about breaking rules, yes, but new, often equally rigid fashion rules quickly took their place. The miniskirt became a symbol of freedom and youth, but it came with the implicit requirement of smooth legs, turning grooming into a condition for participating in this freedom. It's a subtle trap. You're free to wear the miniskirt, but only if your body conforms to the aesthetic demanded by the miniskirt. The beauty industry naturally was thrilled with the miniskirt. More exposed skin meant more opportunity to sell products for smooth skin. Shaving companies, waxing product manufacturers, depilatory creators, they all saw their market expand and solidify. The narrative wasn't just about hygiene anymore. It was explicitly tied to fashion and desirability. Advertisements showed women confidently wearing miniskirts or bikinis, with implied or explicit links to the use of hair removal products. The message was clear. If you want to be cool, modern, and attractive, you need to be smooth. This tension between the natural look championed by the counterculture and the groomed look dictated by mainstream fashion in the beauty industry is a fascinating aspect of the 1960s. Historians still argue whether the counterculture's embrace of natural body hair had any lasting impact on mainstream beauty standards, or if it was simply a temporary, localized rebellion that ultimately failed to stem the tide of increasing hair removal expectations. Did the sight of women in the counterculture with visible body hair normalize it at all? Or did it simply reinforce the idea that it was something only done by those outside the fashionable mainstream? The grooming routine for a fashionable woman in the late 1960s would likely involve regular shaving or waxing of the legs, underarms, and careful management of the bikini line, especially if she was wearing swimwear. The time and effort required to maintain this smooth ideal were considerable, a hidden cost of participating in the era's popular fashions. It wasn't just about getting dressed anymore. It was about preparing your body to be seen in those clothes. The 60s also saw a growing interest in women's health and sexuality, sometimes discussed more openly than in previous decades. While sex manuals might still be coy about explicit details, the broader cultural conversation around the body was changing. This could create a context where private grooming choices might be considered in relation to sexual intimacy, though again, likely influenced by the prevailing aesthetic standards being pushed by fashion and media. The idea of a smooth body as inherently more sensual or appealing likely gained ground during this time, influenced by visual media and advertising. As the decade progressed, the mainstream trend clearly favored the groomed look over the natural. The miniskirt won the cultural battle against the hairy leg, at least in dominant fashion circles. The increased availability and slight improvements in waxing and depilatories offered alternatives to shaving, but the underlying pressure to remove hair remained and even intensified in some areas. So, as you settle into this section, picture the conflicting images. The free-spirited, natural beauty of the hippie juxtaposed with the sharp, sleek lines of the mini-skirted, smooth-legged fashionista. Both represent aspects of the 1960s, but only one reflects the beauty standard that would continue to dominate and expand in the decades to come. The tension between these ideals, in the beauty industry's successful navigation of it to sell more products, is a key part of this story. The miniskirt became not just a fashion statement, but a catalyst, pushing the boundaries of required smoothness further up the leg and solidifying hair removal as a fundamental part of female presentation. Leaving the slightly more grounded, if still idealized figures of the mid-20th century, the pinups and the emerging clean-cut looks, you accelerate through time, and boy, does the pace of change pick up. The late 20th century and the dawn of the 21st century are like hitting fast forward on a cultural VCR. Suddenly, body standards aren't just shifting over generations, they seem to be doing a frantic jig, influenced by a cacophony of voices and images flooding in from every direction. Think about it. For most of history, body ideals trickled down from elites, were depicted in relatively static art forms, or perhaps discussed among physicians and philosophers. Now, with the explosion of mass media, first television, then the internet, and eventually the all-consuming maw of social media, you are bombarded daily, hourly, even minutely, with images of supposedly ideal bodies. These aren't just carefully curated statues in a public square. They are airbrushed magazine covers, hyper-edited music videos, and filtered selfies, each presenting a slice of what someone, somewhere, has deemed desirable. This era sees a rapid oscillation and sometimes simultaneous existence of wildly different ideals. Remember the waif look of the early 90s? Super thin, almost ethereal. Then, not long after, came the fitness craze, celebrating toned, muscular bodies, sometimes bordering on bulky for both men and women. The ideal female form might be celebrated for being rail thin one moment, and then lauded for having strong athletic legs and arms the next. For men, the shift was also pronounced, moving from a more relaxed or naturally muscular physique to an intense focus on sculpted abs, large biceps, and defined pecs, the kind of body that often requires significant dedication in the gym, if not chemical assistance. The pressure to conform or aspire to these rapidly changing ideals intensifies dramatically. Body hair becomes a focal point of this changing landscape. For women, the norm of removing leg and underarm hair, established earlier in the century, solidifies and expands. Bikini lines become a significant area of concern, leading to the rise of specialized waxing salons and, later, the widespread adoption of laser hair removal. The desire for smooth skin extends beyond just necessity or hygiene. It becomes a powerful aesthetic standard and tied to femininity and sexual attractiveness in a way that was arguably less pronounced in earlier eras, even those that practiced hair removal. Smooth skin is no longer just one option. For many areas of the body, it feels like the only acceptable option. And what about hairy backs? Well, in this era of increasing scrutiny and the proliferation of visible skin in fashion and media, a hairy back on a man becomes, for many, definitively undesirable. While chest hair might retain some level of acceptance, particularly in certain cultural subgroups or as a personal preference, back hair is often viewed as something to be removed. Waxing, shaving, laser. Men join women in seeking smooth skin, though perhaps targeting different areas. The concept of manscaping enters the lexicon, a term that would have been utterly baffling to a Roman senator proud of his chest hair. It's not just about looking clean, it's about sculpting and presenting the body according to these new, often hyper-defined standards. Imagine trying to explain laser hair removal to someone from the 18th century. So a beam of light burns the hair follicle permanently to look like a plucked chicken? Fascinating. Can it also cure the plague? As for curved hips, the late 20th and early 21st centuries continue the historical oscillation. The Wayfarer downplayed curves, emphasizing straight lines and angularity. But the 21st century sees a notable resurgence in the appreciation and indeed the active creation of curves. The booty culture that emerges, particularly influenced by celebrity figures and social media, puts a premium on rounded hips and buttocks. This isn't just about being generally curvy in the historical sense. It often focuses on specific, exaggerated proportions. Hip-to-waist ratios are still discussed, but the desired result is often achieved through targeted exercises, specific clothing, or perhaps most significantly, cosmetic surgery. Liposuction, Brazilian butt lifts, implants, the ability to sculpt your curves or lack thereof, becomes a tangible, if expensive, and sometimes dangerous reality. This leads to a mainstream historical fact. The late 20th and early 21st centuries witnessed an unprecedented global surge in cosmetic procedures, both surgical and non-surgical, aimed at altering physical appearance to align with prevailing beauty standards. From nose jobs and breast augmentation to liposuction and injectables, millions sought to modify their bodies, driven by a mix of personal desire, media influence, and societal pressure. This wasn't just about fixing perceived flaws. It was often about achieving a specific look that was currently trending, a look often presented as effortless and natural, despite being anything but. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the emergence of highly specific, almost absurd, ephemeral body ideals promoted primarily through social media. Concepts like thigh gaps, a space between the upper thighs when standing with feet together, or bikini bridges, when hip bones protrude causing a space between the stomach and a bikini bottom when lying down, gained fleeting but intense traction online, particularly among younger women. These weren't tied to health, fertility, or even long-standing aesthetic principles. They were transient, often physically unattainable for many body types, and highlighted the fragmented and sometimes bizarre nature of digital-era beauty standards. Imagine the Venus de Milo worrying about her thigh gap. She'd just shrug her missing shoulders and get back to looking timelessly beautiful. The influence of globalization is also key in this period. Western beauty standards, heavily amplified by Hollywood and international fashion magazines, spread globally, sometimes displacing or merging with local ideals. However, the internet also allowed for the rise of non-Western beauty influencers and the appreciation of diverse body types, creating a complex and sometimes contradictory global beauty landscape. You could be influenced by Korean beauty standards one minute and Brazilian body ideals the next. Historians and sociologists still debate the extent to which media portrayals create body ideals versus simply reflecting existing cultural shifts and desires. Are we seeing these bodies in magazines and on screens because That's what people genuinely find attractive? Or are people finding these bodies attractive because that's what they see everywhere? It's a chicken and egg problem with a significant real-world consequences for body image and self-esteem. The sheer volume and accessibility of imagery make this era unique. You couldn't escape the standards, even if you wanted to. The pressure to achieve these often unrealistic, sometimes contradictory standards led to a rise in body dissatisfaction, eating disorders, and excessive focus on appearance. The very tools designed to connect and inform, social media, could also become engines of comparison and insecurity. While earlier eras had their unattainable ideals too, the constant, in-your-face nature of modern media made the pursuit feel more urgent, more pervasive, and potentially more damaging. You weren't just comparing yourself to the local wealthy family. You were comparing yourself to photoshopped celebrities and curated online personas from around the world. It's enough to make anyone want to pull the covers over their head. So in this whirlwind tour of late 20th and early 21st century body standards, you see the ancient concerns about hair and curves persist, but warped and amplified by technology and global media. Smoothness becomes an almost absolute standard for many areas, not just a preference. Curves are back, but often in hyper-specific, potentially surgically enhanced forms. And the sheer speed at which these ideals can change and spread is unprecedented, leaving many struggling to keep up or feeling inadequate in the face of manufactured perfection. Leaving the intense, image-saturated world of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, you barely have time to catch your breath before the landscape shifts again, often in surprising and sometimes contradictory ways. The era you find yourself in now, the immediate past bleeding into the present moment, is less about a single dominant ideal conquering all and more about a fragmented, complex, and often noisy conversation about bodies and beauty. It's a world where competing ideas clash, where movements rise to challenge the very standards that seemed so powerful just a moment ago. Think about the sheer force of those manufactured ideals we just discussed. The waif look, the sculpted fitness physiques, the hyper-specific curves achieved through sweat or surgery. They were potent, pervasive, and for many, incredibly damaging. But as often happens when a pressure reaches its peak, a counter-pressure begins to build. And one of the most significant developments of this recent era is the rise and increasing visibility of the body positivity movement. This wasn't a new idea. People have always pushed back against narrow definitions of beauty. But in the digital age, it found a platform and a voice that could finally compete with the mainstream media's megaphone. Suddenly, you weren't just seeing photoshopped perfection. You started seeing people celebrating bodies of all shapes, sizes, abilities, and appearances online. The focus shifted, or at least attempted to shift, from aspiration to acceptance. The message became, your body is okay as it is right now. You don't need to be airbrushed or adhere to an arbitrary set of measurements to be worthy or attractive. This movement, born largely online but spilling into advertising and mainstream media, began to chip away at the monolithic standards that had caused so much distress. It encouraged embracing your natural form, stretch marks, cellulite, scars, and all the little imperfections that make you, well, you. Trying to love yourself exactly as you are. Revolutionary, I know. Who needs a six-pack when you have a cozy blanket and zero judgment from the cat? This pushback also intertwined with broader movements advocating for diversity and inclusion. Representation in media started to slowly broaden. You began to see models who weren't just tall, white, and impossibly thin. Different ethnicities, body types, ages, and abilities started appearing in campaigns, on runways, and in magazines. While tokenism was, and is still a problem, the mere presence of bodies that defied the traditional mold started to normalize the idea that beauty comes in countless forms. This wasn't just a niche idea anymore. Major brands began to recognize the marketing power and the moral imperative of showing a more realistic and diverse range of bodies. It turns out the world isn't populated solely by people who look like they walked off a 90s Calvin Klein ad. Shocking, I know. So how do hairy backs and curved hips fit into this more fragmented, self-accepting, or at least trying to be self-accepting, landscape? It gets complicated. While the body positivity movement encourages acceptance of natural states, the previous era's ideals didn't just vanish, they still exist, particularly amplified by platforms that reward visual perfection and comparison. For hairy backs, the norm established in the late 20th century that a smooth back is preferable on a man largely persists in mainstream culture. Advertising for grooming products, images in men's magazines, and certainly the aesthetics favored in pornography often depict smooth-backed men. However, within the broader conversation about body acceptance, there are pockets of resistance or simply indifference. Some men, influenced by the body positivity movement, are choosing to embrace their natural body hair, back included. Some partners prefer it. Online communities discuss body hair acceptance for all genders. It's less of a universal standard and more of a personal choice debated within a wider cultural context. While waxing salons still thrive, so too do voices saying, "Hey, it's just hair. What's the big deal?" It's a far cry from the Roman ideal, but also a step back from the absolute smooth as king mandate of the recent past. Imagine telling a modern influencer that their back fur is a sign of virility. They'd probably ask which filter makes it look thinner. Curved hips, on the other hand, remain very much in vogue, but the conversation around them has become even more layered. The booty culture that emerged in the 21st century hasn't disappeared. In many ways, it has intensified, becoming a global phenomenon. The desire for pronounced curves, particularly in the hip and buttock area, continues to drive trends in fashion, exercise, and especially cosmetic surgery. Brazil butt lifts, BBLs, became incredibly popular, despite significant risks, highlighting the lengths to which some will go to achieve this specific look. However, this ideal now exists alongside the body positivity movement, which preaches loving the hips you have, whatever their satiety or shape. It also coexists with a growing awareness of the artificiality of many images seen online and in media, leading to discussions about authenticity versus manufactured beauty. So you have this interesting tension, a strong cultural pull towards dramatic curves, often surgically enhanced, running parallel to a movement urging acceptance of natural bodies and a growing critique of unrealistic ideals. It's like trying to follow three different dance steps at once. Confusing, and you might just trip. A mainstream historical fact from this period is the significant shift in advertising and corporate messaging around body image. Following pressure from consumers and the rise of movements like body positivity, many major brands explicitly began featuring more diverse body types and including messages of self-acceptance in their campaigns. This wasn't purely altruistic, of course. It was also a response to market demand and public relations considerations. But the sheer volume of imagery featuring non-traditional bodies, even if sometimes performative, marked a distinct departure from the almost exclusively thin, often white, idealized bodies that dominated marketing for decades. You might still see airbrush perfection, but you're now much more likely to also see campaigns featuring people who look more like your neighbors, your family, or even yourself. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the fragmentation of ideals in the digital age is the rise of highly specific and often niche aesthetic communities online, celebrating body types or features that are far outside the mainstream. This could be anything from communities dedicated to appreciating plus-size bodies in specific aesthetics, like cottagecore or grunge, to those celebrating unique physical traits like vitiligo, or specific types of birthmarks, to even more unusual preferences. These weren't just small groups. Aided by social media, these communities could find each other globally, reinforcing the idea that there isn't one single way to be beautiful, but rather countless overlapping and sometimes contradictory ideals, celebrated in digital corners. You could find people who genuinely find a hairy back the height of sexiness, or who prefer straight hips over curved ones, and they could find others who agree. It's like finding the perfect obscure band. Suddenly you're not alone in your niche taste. Historians and sociologists still debate the long-term impact and true effectiveness of the body positivity movement. Has it genuinely shifted societal standards and improved collective body image? Or has it been largely co-opted by commercial interests, turning self-love into another product to sell, while the underlying pressures to conform remain? Is the increased diversity in media a fundamental change or a temporary trend driven by political correctness and marketing? It's hard to say when you're living inside the shift. You're still feeling the push and pull every time you scroll through your feed. The current era, therefore, is a confusing mix of old pressures and new forms of resistance. You are still bombarded with images of idealized bodies, often digitally enhanced to an impossible degree. The desire for smooth skin in certain areas and specific types of curves, or lack thereof, depending on the fleeting trend, remains strong for many. But you also see a powerful and growing counter-narrative celebrating natural bodies, diversity, and self-acceptance. The conversation about hairy backs isn't settled. For some, it's still something to be removed. For others, it's just part of being human. Curved hips are desired, perhaps more than ever, but the means of achieving them are debated, and the inherent beauty of naturally occurring shapes is also being highlighted. You navigate this landscape with a million competing signals. Is your body good enough as it is? Or should you strive for the sculpted, smooth, or dramatically curved figures you see everywhere? The answer feels less clear than it might have in eras with more singular, if unattainable, ideals. The pressure is still there, but now it comes from multiple directions, layered with messages of acceptance that can sometimes feel contradictory. It's enough to make you want to just curl up and ignore it all, which honestly is probably a very sensible instinct right now. Feeling the pull of those conflicting currents from the last section, the urge to just disengage from the whole messy business is perfectly understandable. You've just waded through centuries of people stressing about hair that's there, hair that's not there, and whether curves are in or out. It's a lot to process, especially when you're just trying to relax. But as the present bleeds into what might be coming next, it's worth taking a moment to look back at the whole wild ride and see what patterns emerge from the historical haze, perhaps offering a tiny bit of perspective on why things feel so complicated right now. Remember way back, practically a lifetime ago in this journey when we talked about the ancient world? Egyptians meticulously removing body hair with copper tools, Romans associating virility with a full back, but also using elaborate depilatories. Even then, there wasn't one single, unchanging rule. There were different ideas, different methods, and a clear understanding that bodies were things you worked on, shaped, and presented according to the norms of the time. Fast forward through the Renaissance, where a bit of hair was maybe okay, but pale skin was paramount, or the Victorians with their elaborate cover-ups and hidden anxieties. Each era had its own specific hang-ups and ideals, often layered on top of or reacting against what came before. The big takeaway, if there is one from this sleepy historical ramble, is that the idea of a perfect body has always been a moving target. What is considered beautiful, desirable, or even just normal for something as simple as body hair or hip shape isn't some fundamental truth handed down from the universe. It's a cultural construct built up over time through art, medicine, fashion, power structures, and yes, even things as mundane as advertisements for hair removal cream or corsets. Your journey through these different eras highlights how dramatically these ideals can swing. From valuing voluptuousness to embracing a more boyish figure, from preferring smooth skin everywhere to allowing for visible hair. Think about the cyclical nature of some of these trends. We saw periods where plumpness was a sign of health and wealth, then eras where thinness was the marker of refinement. We saw body hair embraced in some contexts, then systematically eradicated in others. While a straight-up historical rerun of, say, the ancient Greek athletic ideal or the Gibson girl figure seems unlikely, the underlying mechanism of change remains. Society decides what it values, and individuals often feel immense pressure to conform, using whatever tools are available, be it diet, exercise, clothing, makeup, or surgical intervention, to get closer to that moving target. And the tools available today are, well, they add a whole new dimension. The current era you're navigating isn't just a continuation of past trends, it's amplified and distorted by technology in ways previous generations couldn't have imagined. Social media, as we touched on, creates a constant, curated stream of idealized images, making comparison not just possible but almost unavoidable. Filters can instantly smooth skin, reshape faces, and yes, add or subtract curves or body hair with terrifying ease. This doesn't just reinforce existing ideals, it creates new ones, often based on digitally impossible realities. The idea of a natural body starts to feel less relevant when you can instantly apply a layer of digital perfection before posting a photo. Remember when we talked about the effort people went to for smooth skin in Roman times? Now you can get a digital version with a swipe. Progress? Maybe. Beyond simple filters, you have the increasing sophistication of cosmetic procedures, some driven by a desire for features like pronounced curves. While cosmetic surgery isn't new, heck, people were trying to reshape noses centuries ago, the accessibility, variety, and precision available today mean that achieving certain looks is a much more tangible, albeit sometimes risky, possibility for those with resources. The desire for specific hip-to-waist ratios, fueled by online aesthetics, has translated into real-world procedures, sometimes pushing the boundaries of safety. It's a stark reminder that while body positivity pushes for acceptance of what is natural, the tools to change what is natural are more powerful than ever. This duality, the push for acceptance versus the enhanced capacity for alteration, is one of the defining tensions of the current moment. It makes navigating body image particularly complex. Are you supposed to love your body as it is, stretch marks and all, because that's the message of body positivity? Or are you supposed to constantly optimize and modify it using the latest tech, filters, or procedures, because that's the visual language of so much online culture? It's a genuinely disorienting space to inhabit, and it's no wonder so many people feel confused or inadequate. It's like being told to appreciate a painting, but then being shown a photoshopped version of it everywhere you look, and suddenly you're not sure which one is the right one. Consider the impact of things like artificial intelligence on this. AI can now generate incredibly realistic images of people who don't exist, perfectly tailored to whatever aesthetic ideal it's prompted with. This isn't just retouching, it's creating entirely synthetic ideals that can further blur the lines between reality and aspiration. Will we reach a point where the most desired bodies are those that are literally impossible for a human to possess without significant digital or physical alteration? It sounds like science fiction, but the technology is already here, shaping what we see and what we think is possible or desirable. A mainstream historical fact from this period is the explosive growth of the cosmetic surgery industry globally. Driven by cultural trends, increased disposable income in certain areas, and the amplifying power of social media, procedures aimed at altering body shape, particularly targeting features like hips and buttocks, have seen massive increases in popularity over the past 2 decades. This isn't just a niche phenomenon, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry reflecting widespread desires to conform to or achieve specific body types, often those prominently featured online or in popular culture. It's a tangible manifestation of those shifting beauty standards we've been tracking. A quirky or fringe tidbit illustrating the extreme ends of modern body manipulation and aesthetic ideals is the emergence of things like digital fashion or avatars in virtual worlds where individuals can experiment with completely non-physical body types and appearances. In gaming or social VR platforms, you can be whatever shape you want, have skin any color, and literally add or remove body parts at will. This isn't a physical body, but it's a representation of self, and the ideals pursued in these digital spaces, while separate from physical reality, still reflect desires and potentially influence perceptions of what's aesthetically pleasing or cool. But don't imagine having a perfectly smooth back in your favorite online game while dealing with real-world stubble. The disconnect is wild. Historians, sociologists, and cultural theorists still debate furiously about the future trajectory of beauty standards in the face of technological advancement and movements like body positivity. Will we see a greater acceptance of natural diversity, where hairy backs and curved hips are simply features without loaded meaning? Or will the power of digital manipulation and cosmetic technology lead to increasingly uniform, artificial, and unattainable ideals? creating an even wider gap between how we look and how we're told we should look. It's the big question mark hanging over the end of our journey, a future that hasn't been written yet, still pulled between the forces of acceptance and aspiration. So where does that leave you at the end of this long, winding road through history, body hair, and hip shapes? You've seen that beauty standards are constantly in flux, shaped by forces far beyond individual control. You've seen that anxieties about appearance, even about specific details like a hairy back or the curve of a hip, are not new. They are threads woven throughout human history. And you've seen that the present moment, while perhaps uniquely complex due to technology and competing cultural messages, is just the latest chapter in this ongoing story of how societies define and redefine the physical self. The next time you catch yourself worrying about a perceived flaw or comparing yourself to an image online, maybe, just maybe, remembering this journey will offer a tiny flicker of perspective, that the ideal you're chasing or the feature you're stressing about is just one fleeting idea in a long, long history of changing ideas. That your body, in its natural state, with all its quirks and curves and hairs, would have been celebrated or seen as perfectly normal in countless other times and places. It's a small comfort in a noisy world, but hopefully, it's a comforting thought nonetheless. As the images of ancient baths, Victorian parlors, and scrolling feeds start to fade, the main point is this: you've traveled through time to see that what the world tells you about your body is just a story it's telling right now. And like all stories, it changes. Maybe understanding that makes the present pressures just a little less heavy, a little less real, and a little easier to drift away from. Word count, 2195. Awaiting continue. Wind down begins here. Now let the echoes of those historical voices, the whispers of changing ideals and endless human striving, begin to soften. You've journeyed through so many different times, so many different ways of seeing and being seen. It's time to gently release the grip of those images and ideas. The journey is complete for tonight. The pressures of the past and the confusions of the present can recede into the distance. Feel the weight of your own body where you are, here and now, supported and safe. There's no performance needed, no ideal to chase in this quiet space, just the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Let the final vestiges of the story fade, like sunlight dipping below the horizon, leaving only the soft, calm embrace of the night. Your body is simply here, in this moment, exactly as it is. It has carried you through this entire exploration, and now it asks for nothing but rest. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, releasing any last tension from your shoulders, your jaw, your feet. The historical journey is over. The focus is now simply on being still, being present, and letting the quiet settle in. All the striving, all the standards, they belong to the past, or to a world outside this peaceful bubble. Here now there is only ease. End of script, sweet dreams.